Hello and welcome. In today's video, we are going to talk about the Leichter Kampfwagen II. The Leichter Kampfwagen II was the most produced German World War I era tank. After the first tests of the LK-1 tank in March and April 1918, the OHL ordered Joseph Vollmer to design an alternative LK tank. The reason they decided to construct an entirely new tank was that they believed that the LK-1 was too thinly armored, and also because the 14 cm wide tracks initially installed on the LK-1 were too narrow. So the only new requirements were 25 cm wide tracks and a minimum armor thickness of 13 mm. Joseph Vollmer began the redesign in April or May 1918. He tried to keep everything as original as possible while still installing thicker armor on the tank. The frontal plate was still sloped upwards, and the upper side of the bonnet side was also sloped upwards. And sloped plates were also installed where the driver had his side hatches he used to observe the ground. The running gear still came from a car or truck chassis. On June 13, 1918, Joseph Vollmer presented the LK-1 tank and the LK-2 tank drawings to Oberstleutnant Max Bauer, head of OHL Operations Section 2. And on June 23, 1918, 580 production variants of the new LK-2 tank with machine guns were ordered, before any prototypes had been ordered or built. Vollmer was also given the task to design an LK-2 with a 5.7 cm Maxim Nordenfelt cannon as main armament. The gun would be too large to fit in a revolving turret, so a decision was made to construct a rigid case made at the rear of the tank that could accommodate the size of the gun. Now we will look at the variants. There was the German LK-Wagen mit MG in Drehturm, and there was the Hungarian LK-Wagen mit MG in Drehturm. There was the LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone. There was the Stridsvagn modell 1920, or Strv M21 for short, and the Stridsvagn modell 1920-29, or Strv M21-29 for short. Now we will go through the different variants. First, the German LK-Wagen mit MG in Drehturm. The tank had 74 track links connected by track pins. The track width was 25 cm. The track had 2.5 meters of ground contact. The 29-wheel suspension were divided into 24 road wheels and 5 return rollers. The 24 road wheels were divided into 6 units with 24 cylindrical coil springs, one on each road wheel. The drive sprocket wheel is located at the rear with the idler wheel in the front. The drive sprocket wheel is connected to the gearbox at the rear. The tank had a gearbox with 4 speeds forward and 1 reverse gear. The transmission is connected to the engine at the front. The engine was a Daimler Model 1910 4-cylinder petrol engine, producing 60 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. The engine was a 45 kilowatt. The engine could be started with the crank at the front. The radiator was located in front of the engine. Next to the engines were 2 150-liter fuel tanks. The tank's armor was rolled steel. The armor plates were bolted together on a riveted chassis. The armor thickness was 14 mm sloped armor at the front, 12 mm at the sides, rear and turret. 8 mm on the roof, and 4 mm on the bottom of the tank. Armament consisted of one water-cooled 7.92 mm MG08 machine gun mounted in the fully traversable turret. The turret had an elevation of 41 degrees. There was also one spare MG08 for disembarking. The gun's fire rate was 600 rounds per minute. The tank carried 3,000 rounds of ammunition for the machine gun. The hook was placed at the rear. There was a grill on top of the bonnet sides at the front and ventilation slits on each side. The crew consisted of 2 men, a driver that sat on the driver's chair in the middle of the tank, and a tank commander that stood in the one-man turret behind him. It was also his job to shoot and reload the gun. To rotate the turret, the commander had to grab 2 handles, brace his back against 2 pads at the back of the turret, and use his legs and arms to physically move the turret. The tank had a length of 5.1 meters, a height of 2.5 meters, and a width of 1.95 meters. The tank weighed 8.75 metric tons, had a top speed of 16 km per hour on roads and 6 km per hour cross country, and it had a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. Now, the Hungarian LK-Wagen mit MG in Drehturm. The tank had 74 track links connected by track pins. The track width was 25 centimeters. The track had 2.5 meters of ground contact. The 29-wheel suspension were divided into 24 road wheels and 5 return rollers. The 24 road wheels were divided into 6 units with 24 cylindrical coil springs, one on each road wheel. The drive sprocket wheel is located at the rear with the idler wheel in the front. The drive sprocket wheel is connected to the gearbox at the rear. The tank had a gearbox with 4 speeds forward and 1 reverse gear. The transmission is connected to the engine at the front. The engine was a Daimler Model 1910 4-cylinder petrol engine, producing 60 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. The engine was a 45 kilowatt. The engine could be started with the crank at the front. The radiator was located in front of the engine. Next to the engines were 2 150-liter fuel tanks. The tank's armor was rolled steel. The armor plates were bolted together on a riveted chassis. The armor thickness was 14 mm sloped armor at the front, 12 mm at the sides, rear and turret. 8 mm on the roof, and 4 mm on the bottom of the tank. Armament consisted of 3 8mm Svarslose Model 7/12 machine guns, mounted in the fully traversable turret and on each side of the fighting compartment. The turret had an elevation of 41 degrees. The gun's fire rate was 580 rounds per minute. It likely carried around 9,000 rounds of ammunition for the machine guns. The hook was placed at the rear. There was a grill on top of the bonnet sides at the front and ventilation slits on each side. The crew consisted of 4 men. A driver that sat on the driver's chair in the middle of the tank, and 2 machine gunners that used the machine guns on each side, and a tank commander that stood in the one-man turret behind him. It was also his job to shoot and reload the gun. To rotate the turret, the commander had to grab 2 handles, brace his back against 2 pads at the back of the turret, and use his legs and arms to physically move the turret. The tank had a length of 5.1 meters, a height of 2.5 meters, and a width of 1.95 meters. The tank weighed 8.75 metric tons, had a top speed of 16 km per hour on roads and 6 km per hour cross country, and it had a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. And now to the LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone. The tank had 74 track links connected by track pins. The track width was 25 centimeters. The track had 2.5 meters of ground contact. The 29-wheel suspension were divided into 24 road wheels and 5 return rollers. The 24 road wheels were divided into 6 units with 24 cylindrical coil springs, one on each road wheel. The drive sprocket wheel is located at the rear with the idler wheel in the front. The drive sprocket wheel is connected to the gearbox at the rear. The tank had a gearbox with 4 speeds forward and 1 reverse gear. The transmission is connected to the engine at the front. The engine was a Daimler Model 1910 4-cylinder petrol engine, producing 60 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. The engine was a 45 kilowatt. The engine could be started with the crank at the front. The radiator was located in front of the engine. Next to the engines were 2 150-liter fuel tanks. The tank's armor was rolled steel. The armor plates were bolted together on a riveted chassis. The armor thickness was 14 mm sloped armor at the front, 12 mm at the sides, rear and turret. 8 mm on the roof, and 4 mm on the bottom of the tank. Armament consisted of 1 quick-firing 5.7 cm Maxim Nordenfeldt L26.3 cannon. The barrel length was 1.5 meters. The gun had a muzzle velocity of 487 meters per second. The gun's fire rate was 12 rounds per minute. The gun could penetrate 20mm armor at a range of 1 kilometer. The gun's effective firing range was 2.7 kilometers. The gun's maximum range was 6.4 kilometers. It had a girt sight with a range of 4 kilometers. Horizontal aiming was 30 degrees. It carried 100 rounds, split between armor-piercing, canister and high-explosive rounds for the 57mm gun. There were 6 slits at the front of the bonnet for ventilation. There was also a hatch on the top of the bonnet and ventilation slits on each side. The crew consisted of 3 men, a driver that sat on the driver's chair in the middle of the tank, and a gunner who was also probably the commander that stood to the left side of the gun in the fixed mount, and a loader that stood to the right side of the gun. The tank had a length of 5.08 meters, a height of 2.675 meters, and a width of 1.95 meters. It weighed 8.5 metric tons, had a top speed of 16 kilometers per hour on roads and 6 kilometers per hour cross country, and it had a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. Now to the Strv M21. The tank had 74 track links connected by track pins. The track width was 25 centimeters. The track had 2.5 meters of ground contact. The 29-wheel suspension were divided into 24 road wheels and 5 return rollers. The 24 road wheels were divided into 6 units with 24 cylindrical coil springs, one on each road wheel. The drive sprocket wheel is located at the rear with the idler wheel in the front. The drive sprocket wheel is connected to the gearbox at the rear. The tank had a gearbox with 4 speeds forward and 1 reverse gear. The transmission is connected to the engine at the front. The engine was a Daimler Model 1910 4-cylinder petrol engine, producing 60 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. The engine was a 45 kilowatt. The engine could be started with the crank at the front. The radiator was located in front of the engine. Next to the engines were 2 150-liter fuel tanks. The tank's armor was rolled steel. The armor plates were bolted together on a riveted chassis. The armor thickness was 14mm sloped armor at the front, 12mm at the sides, rear and turret. $8mm on the roof, and 4mm on the bottom of the tank. Armament consisted of 1 to 4 6.5mm Kulsprota M14 machine guns, mounted in the fully traversable turret, or mounted on the hull side or in the hatch on the rear door, or at the front. The turret had an elevation of 41 degrees. The gun's fire rate was 480 rounds per minute. One tank was also armed with a 37mm Puteaux SA-18 cannon in 1923. The gun's fire rate was 12 rounds per minute. The gun's muzzle velocity was 410 meters per second. The hook was placed at the rear. There was a grill on top of the bonnet sides at the front and ventilation slits on each side. The crew consisted of 2 to 4 men, a driver that sat on the driver's chair in the middle of the tank, and a tank commander that stood in the one-man turret behind him. It was also his job to shoot and reload the gun. To rotate the turret, the commander had to grab 2 handles, brace his back against 2 pads at the back of the turret, and use his legs and arms to physically move the turret. There were also sometimes 2 machine gunners that used the machine guns on each side or the one at the back. The tank had a length of 5.1 meters, a height of 2.5 meters, and a width of 1.95 meters. The tank weighed 8.75 metric tons, had a top speed of 16 kilometers per hour on roads and 6 kilometers per hour cross country, and it had a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. And now the last one, the Strv M21-29. The tank had 74 track links connected by track pins. The track width was 25 centimeters. The track had 2.5 meters of ground contact. The 29-wheel suspension were divided into 24 road wheels and 5 return rollers. The 24 road wheels were divided into 6 units with 24 cylindrical coil springs, one on each road wheel. The drive sprocket wheel is located at the rear with the idler wheel in the front. The drive sprocket wheel is connected to the gearbox at the rear. The tank had a gearbox with 4 speeds forward and 1 reverse gear. The transmission is connected to the engine at the front. The engine was a Scania Vabis 1554 4-cylinder petrol engine producing 85 horsepower at 1500 revolutions per minute. The engine could be started with the crank inside or with an electric starter. The radiator was located in front of the engine. There was a fuel tank with around 300 liters of fuel next to the engine. The tank's armor was rolled steel. The armor plates were bolted together on a riveted chassis. The armor thickness was 14 mm sloped armor at the front, 12 mm at the sides, rear and turret, 8 mm on the roof, and 4 mm on the bottom of the tank. Armament consisted of 3 to 4 6.5 mm Kulsprota M14-29 machine guns, mounted in the fully traversable turret and on the hull side and on the hatch in the rear door or at the front. The turret had an elevation of 41 degrees. The gun's fire rate was 480 rounds per minute. Some tanks were also equipped with the Skoda 3.7 cm D27 infantry gun in the early 1930s. The barrel length was 0.5 meters. The gun had a muzzle velocity of 460 meters per second. The gun's maximum range was 6 to 6.5 kilometers. The hook was placed at the rear. There was a grille on top of the bonnet sides at the front and ventilation slits on each side. The crew consisted of 4 men. A driver that sat on the driver's chair in the middle of the tank, and a tank commander that stood in the one-man turret behind him. It was also his job to shoot and reload the gun. To rotate the turret, the commander had to grab 2 handles, brace his back against 2 pads at the back of the turret, and use his legs and arms to physically move the turret. There were also 2 machine gunners that used the machine guns on each side or the one at the back. The tank had a length of 5.1 meters, a height of 2.5 meters, and a width of 1.95 meters. The tank weighed 8.75 metric tons, had a top speed of 18 km per hour on roads and 6 km per hour cross country, and it had a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. The tank could climb slopes up to 45 degrees. The tank could cross trenches up to 3 meters in width. From 1918 to 1920, it is believed that at least 40 LK-2 tanks were built. 1 gun tank, 10 sold to Sweden, 14 sold to Hungary, 15 at the Steffensen factory that were never sold, so around 40 in total. Now to the companies. Development and production of the transmission was Adler in Frankfurt. Development and production of the engine was Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft in Berlin and Scania Vabis in Södertälje. Assembly of finished chassis and armor was Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft in Berlin, Steffensen Heimann in Berlin, Wilhelm Üschle Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung in Berlin-Friedenau, Aktiebolaget Landswerk in Landskrona, Nyqvist and Holm Aktiebolaget in Trollhättan, and the Royal Naval Shipyard in Stockholm, main gun and machine guns, weapons workshop in Spandau, and Carl Gustav Startgewehrfaktory in Eskilstuna. Production cost was 65,000 to 70,000 German mark in 1918 for 1 LK-2 tank. The driver had 2 vision slits in front of him and 1 on each side. The commander had vision slits on the turret side and in the cupola. There was a door on each side of the fighting compartment, and all machine gun variants also had a door in the back. Most tanks received internal lighting inside the tank. The alternator we see here is for the light, and a machine gun shield was also added in 1930. The upgraded Strv M21-29 received a new Scania Vabis 1554 85 horsepower engine and a new gearbox. The tanks also received either the Skoda 3.7 cm D27 or the Kulsprota M14-29 machine gun, and headlights and headlight covers. This happened from 1930 to 1932. There are also small changes between the tanks assembled in Germany and the tanks assembled in Sweden. For example, the Swedish assembled tanks got the door handle to the left and the German to the right. The Swedish got 2 bolts on the turret front, the German got 3. The Swedish got 3 bolts next to the front vision slit, the German got 4. The Swedish got 4 bolts on the front plate, the German got 5. The tank was named the Leichter Kampfwagen II, Light Combat Vehicle 2, or just LK2 for short. The tanks were designated Leichter Kampfwagen II, LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone, LK-Wagen mit MG Drehturm by the Germans in 1918. We don't know what the Hungarian LK2 tanks were called. The Swedish tanks were designated Pansarvagn försöksmodell 1922 in 1922, Stridsvagn modell 1921 from 1924 to 1927, and again from 1929 onwards. Stridsvagn försöksmodell 1921 in 1927, and Stridsvagn modell 1921 to 29 from 1929 and onwards. All the Swedish tanks had a tank number. Number 1 was a Strv M21. Number 2 was a Strv M21, which was later upgraded to the Strv M21-29. Number 3 was also a Strv M21, and later an Strv M21-29. Number 4 was also an Strv M21, and later an Strv M21-29. Number 5 was also an Strv M21, and later an Strv M21-29. Number 6 was an Strv M21. Number 7 was an Strv M21, and later an Strv M21-29. Number 8 was an Strv M21. Number 9 was an Strv M21, and number 10 was also just an Strv M21. Production began in late June 1918. The first prototype chassis was finished in mid-July 1918. On July 17, 1918, the War Ministry began discussions on placing an order for 670 LK2s, and with the possibility for further orders for a total of 2,000 tanks that should be ready by June 30, 1919, and 2,000 more by December 1919, 4,000 in all. But no order had been given yet. On August 8, 1918, Hermann Meyer reported to the OHL that based on the discussions taken on June 13th, 270 LK2s and 33 Krupp Leichte Zugmaschine armored artillery tractors should be acquired by April 1919, and that, starting in April 1919, 200 LK2 light tanks would be produced every month. In late August 1918, Hermann Meyer reported to the OHL that the order for 270 LK2 tanks had grown to 580 LK2s, plus a decrease to 20 Krupp Leichte Zugmaschine. The LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone started driving trials on August 20th, and on August 29th, firing trials were conducted, where it was realized that the body couldn't handle the recoil of the 5.7 cm gun, so a report established that the 5.7 cm cannon could not be used in the LK2. The tank tail was too heavy and thus difficult to steer cross-country, and a new solution had to be found. On August 30th, 1918, the LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone was transported to Saarburg to take part in training exercises together with Sturmpanzerkraftwagen Abteilung III, consisting of A7V tanks 503, 505, 507, 543 and 564 that we can see here on their way to Saarburg between August 22nd and 24th. On September 1st, 1918, the order for LK2s was raised again, now to 800 LK2 tanks. Immediately afterwards, the number for LK2s ordered was raised again, now to 1,385, plus 65 Leichter Zugmaschine, all to be delivered in the spring of 1919, with the option to order even more. The LK-Wagen mit 5,7 cm Kanone would be used in different exercises with the A7Vs for the next month, like on September 7th, where it took part in an exercise with A7V Tank 505. These pictures were taken in August, September or early October 1918. On September 30th, a solution was found to the 5.7 cm cannon issue. The OHL ordered that the Krupp 3.7 cm tank Abwehrkanone should instead be installed in all LK2 gun variants, and that 2 out of 3 of the tanks should be gun tanks and 1 out of 3 should be machine gun tanks. During trials, it was also discovered that the engine overheated. The ventilation louvers at the front of the tank and those on the side did not ventilate the engine compartment sufficiently. The solution was found in October 1918. What they did was to lengthen the bonnet and slope the front plate upwards, and remove the ventilation louvers and instead install a ventilation grill at the front upper side of the bonnet. The LK2 machine gun tanks now also began construction, with the new design modifications incorporated. When the A7Vs went back to the front in early October 1918, the LK-Wagen with 5,7 cm Kanone was likely sent back to Berlin again. The prototype never received the Krupp 3.7 cm tank Abwehrkanone, likely because it was still only in the development phase. On October 2, 1918, the LK-Wagen with MG Drehturm test model chassis without armor was finished and left the production line on October 10th, and performed very well in its first trials. In October, the LK-Wagen with 5,7 cm Kanone likely just stayed in Berlin, where it was used in exercises and even received a camouflage pattern. By November 1918, more LK-Wagen with MG Drehturm tanks were nearing completion, but on November 11, 1918, Germany signed the armistice and the war was over, so they didn't need the tanks anymore, and all orders were cancelled. And on June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, which prohibited the Weimar Republic from producing, buying or selling tanks. We're not sure what happened to the LK-Wagen with 5,7 cm Kanone chassis. It was likely scrapped soon after the war had ended. But on September 30th, 1919, the Weimar Republic ordered 90 LK-Wagen with MG Drehturm tanks that should be used to defend the eastern border against Polish insurgents. So production and assembly was resumed. Here we see a photo of the assembly hall at the Steffensen-Heimann factory. The picture was likely taken when production resumed in late 1919. Here we see 2 photos of the finished LK2 tanks outside the Steffensen-Heimann factory. The picture was likely taken when production resumed in late 1919, or maybe in early 1920. But on January 10, 1920, the Treaty of Versailles came into effect, and all tanks had to be destroyed. But the chassis were kept, because the Germans didn't want to scrap them. The Steffensen-Heimann Engineering Company in Berlin-Charlottenburg and Wilhelm Uecher Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung in Berlin-Friedenau, and possibly also other companies that had helped with the assembly, were given the task to sell the tanks to foreign countries, officially as tractors, but in secret as tanks. After the First World War, many new countries had been formed, and land disputes were common, as well as internal uprisings. One of those new countries was the Kingdom of Hungary, formed in 1920. Hungary had problems protecting its borders from the neighboring countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So in early 1920, the Hungarian delegates in Berlin managed to negotiate a deal with the Germans to buy one LK2 MG type in secret. Shortly afterwards, another, and somewhat later in 1920, 12 more were purchased. The LK2 tanks arrived on barges shipped along the Danube River. The tanks were covered in reeds and tarpaulins. All 14 vehicles were given to the Budapest-based Hungarian police recruit school. After the First World War, the Kingdom of Sweden also began looking for an opportunity to acquire a tank, not to protect its borders, unless the Bolsheviks took Finland, but more to protect the king if an uprising occurred. So in April 1920, 8 men assigned to the Swedish General Staff were given the task to go abroad and examine and maybe buy machine guns, mortars, infantry guns, anti-aircraft guns, various new grenade types, and tanks. This new committee, as it was called, was granted 1,651,900 Swedish krona for experimenting with the new weapons. On January 22, 1921, head of the Kungliga Arméförvaltningens Artilleridepartementet and Generalpolitikmästaren, Major General Friherr Ulf Lars Carlsson Sparre, sent a letter to the military attaché in Berlin, Paris, Rome, London, and Washington, stating that they should explore the possibilities of buying tanks. And in the summer of 1921, Sweden successfully bought a Renault FT for 37,000 Swedish krona, and it arrived in Stockholm on July 19, 1921. On February 19, 1921, Major Loftsman of the Swedish military attaché in Berlin sent out requests to various companies regarding if they could sell infantry guns with ammunition, anti-aircraft guns with ammunition, weapons to fight tanks, and Kraftwagen for towing artillery. On March 18, 1921, Stefan and Heimann responded with an offer to buy either Leichter Kampfwagen II, which was a Hanomag WD-25 artillery tractor, shown here, or Schwere Kampfwagen II, shown here, which actually was the LK-2 chassis. Raupenschlepper means crawler tractor, or tracked tractor. This picture might have been taken in Germany, because we can see a Hanomag WD-25 tractor. Captain Reinhold Schinström of the engineering office also wrote to Stefan and Heimann in February regarding the purchase of tanks. On July 14, 1921, Stefan and Heimann responded to Captain Reinhold Schinström with an offer to buy 15 Schwere Raupenschlepper, also with armored bodies and machine guns. The price was 261,000 mark per chassis, plus 184,000 mark per armored body, so a total of 445,000 mark for one completed tank, and with the following pictures attached. They were apparently also negotiating with Yugoslavia for the purchase of 15 tanks. In the summer of 1921, Wilhelm Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung offered Major Loftman 10 LK-2 tanks for a much cheaper price, so the Stefan and Heimann offer was rejected. Kungliga Arméförvaltningens Artilleridepartementet asked Major Loftman to offer the 100,000 Swedish krona they were granted for 5 tanks, and also to reserve the last 5 tanks for potential purchase, while the army command tried to get the further 100,000 Swedish krona to buy the last 5 tanks. On July 1st, 1921, the additional 100,000 Swedish krona in funding was granted. In mid-July 1921, Captain Schinström and Captain Elliot traveled to Germany to inspect the tanks, and on July 22nd, 1921, Wilhelm Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung signs the purchase agreement for 10 LK-2 tanks for 200,000 Swedish krona, 2.5 million mark. On July 26, 1921, Bäckström writes and asks for a shipment quote, and instructs Hans or Hansson to load all 10 units and ship them safely to Sweden. The shipment was officially declared as agricultural tractors and steam engine sheet metal. Now back to the Hungarian tanks. Shortly after arriving and assembling in Budapest, the Treaty of Trianon came into effect. This happened on July 26, 1921. What it did was, just like the Weimar Republic, also forbade the Kingdom of Hungary from having tanks. So the LK-2s had to be hidden from the treaty inspectors and were taken apart. The hulls were hidden in country estates of trusted farmers, disguised as agricultural tractors. The armored bodies were put inside railway wagons and kept moving around the country. The Treaty Inspection Committee on one occasion visited a train station where there were some railway cattle wagons containing LK-2 tank bodies, but luckily for the Hungarians, they were not discovered. On September 21, 1921, 5 LK-2 tank chassis arrived in Stockholm. The remaining 5 LK-2 chassis were loaded on and shipped on September 27, 1921. On January 7, 1922, Captain Schinström announced to Major Loftman that approximately 10 tons of sheet metal parts arrived from Lübeck. Some parts are still missing, so the Swedes must buy small things like bolts and nuts in Sweden. Assembly at Stockholm's Tygstation began in early 1922. On March 18th, Captain Schinström said in a letter to Major Loftman that installation work on the armored vehicles had progressed quite far, but some parts are still missing from Germany. The first chassis was completed in March 1922 at a cost of 3,400 Swedish krona. On April 1st, 1922, the construction department sent a proposal to Ulf Lars Carlsson's Sparta regarding the assembly of the last 9 tanks. The construction department believes that the cost will be lower if the assembly was done at a naval shipyard. So on April 3rd, 1922, the head of the KAAD chose the Royal Naval Shipyard to assemble the last 9 tanks. During the assembly of armor, it was discovered that the armor was uncured and had to be cut before assembly. Spare parts were also needed, so on June 22, 1922, spare parts for 198,000 mark were purchased from Wilhelm Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung. The parts arrived on June 25th. The tanks were issued to the 1st Infantry Regiment of the Svea Life Guards in the summer of 1922. The tanks were given the name Pansarvagn försöksmodell 1922, PV-FM-22. Maneuvers were held in September 1922, where these 4 pictures were taken. The 5 tanks present were each given a number between 1 and 10. The last tank was finished and left the shipyard in November 1922. On November 20th, 1922, the Naval Shipyard announced that the total cost of assembly was approximately 22,500 Swedish krona. Now I will show you some photos and footage from around 1922. Here we see 2 PV-FM-22s at the Svea Lifeguard Barracks. Now there will be played some footage of a PV-FM-22 crossing a ditch. Now there will be played some footage of PV-FM-22 number 1 and 6 after being loaded off the train in 1922. In 1923, tank number 5 received the Renault FT's 37mm Pitot SA-18 cannon. The tanks were used in summer exercises from August 20th to September 10th, 1923. The maneuvers were held in Skåne. The tanks were transported there by rail, which also became an additional test. A total of 5 tanks left for the joint exercises, including the one that was re-equipped with the 37mm gun. During these exercises, interaction with infantry was practiced, as well as general tactical issues. This picture was probably taken during the summer exercise. In the autumn maneuvers that took place from mid-September to late October 1923, a tank platoon of 5 tanks conducted training attacks on infantry positions. It was carried out together with their own infantry. First, the tanks went in a chain, and then passed along the enemy positions, pouring fire from machine guns. The military was satisfied with the results of the attack, although certain questions arose. The question was raised whether a radio should be installed in the tanks. The tanks were covered in bushes and trees for camouflage, as you can see. It was also concluded that the 37mm gun was not a success, so tank number 5 was re-equipped with its machine gun in late 1923. Here we see PV-FM-22 number 5 still armed with the cannon on October 2nd. Here we see the tanks used in a parade. These photos were probably taken around 1922 or 23. The next maneuvers were held in early 1924 near Stockholm. At this time, the tanks received winter camouflage for the first time. As you can see here, the tanks overcame snow-covered areas. Their ability to overcome snow-covered climbs was also tested. During the tests, a tank felled a tree with a trunk 36 centimeters thick. A new name for the tanks was also adopted in 1924, Stridsvagn modell 1921, Strv M21, after the year they were acquired. In the summer exercises of 1924, Strv M21 number 10 and 6 were equipped with a radio, and a 4th crew member was introduced. To keep him out of the way, the radio operator's place was in the rear of the tank, as you can see here with number 6. These photos were taken in the summer exercises of 1924. The tanks were used extensively in the following years, like here, where we see one in a forest in the summer exercises of 1925. In the summer exercises, Strv M21 number 6 and 10's radios had also been removed, as you can see. It was only the Renault FT that had one installed, because it was used as a command tank. This is probably also from the summer exercises of 1925. These photos and footage were probably taken around 1924 or 25. This photo was taken at the Strv lifeguard barracks. In 1926, due to a lack of spare parts after extensive use of the tanks in the last few years, tanks number 1, 3, 4, 8 and 9 had to be stripped for parts and were not operational. The tanks also received horizontal and vertical stripes on the turret in 1926. All of these pictures were probably taken in 1926. In 1927, spare parts finally became available, and all 10 tanks became operational at the end of 1927. The tanks were transferred from the 1st Infantry Regiment, Strv Lifeguards, to the 2nd Infantry Regiment, II Lifeguards, also stationed in the Stockholm area. These photos might have been taken in the summer exercises of 1927. In March 1927, the inspectors also left Hungary, so they could now start their tank journey. The first Hungarian tank company was formed in 1928, and in April 1930, after careful inspection of the condition of the disassembled LK-2 hulls and bodies, they assembled 6 tanks and started using them for crew training until more modern tanks became available. In 1931, 5 of the new Italian Fiat 3000B light tanks were bought. The 5 new Fiat 3000Bs and the 5 LK2s, plus 12 modified Fiat 2F trucks were used in the 1st and 2nd training companies, where they served for some years. The 6th tank was kept for driver and maintenance training. Here we see a photo of a Hungarian LK2 tank in the summer of 1932. Here we see some of the tanks of one of the training companies, 2 LK2s and 2 Fiat 3000Bs. The picture was taken in the mid-1930s. In 1928, the II Lifeguards also installed an alternator for the light inside the tanks, and after this upgrade, the tanks were renamed again to Stridsvagn försöksmodell 1928, Strv FM21. By June 1928, the question of upgrading some of the Strv FM21s even further arose. They wanted to try to equip the Strv FM21 with a Skoda 3.7 cm D27 that was much more powerful than the SA-18 cannon. But the real reason for an upgrade was that some of the tanks' engines were worn out and an upgrade was needed. The tanks were not used that much in 1928, since the military primarily focused on the possibility to upgrade them. Here we see an Strv FM21 at the II Lifeguard Barracks in 1928. The tanks had also received a new camouflage pattern. These 2 pictures were probably taken in the summer of 1928. Much of 1928 was also used to plan a tank exercise course that was held from 1929 to 1931. One of the many foreign officers that visited Sweden in 1929 was a relatively unknown German major named Heinz Wilhelm Guderian that we can see here, who came to Sweden and drove one of the Strv FM21s, which was his first experience with tanks, but certainly not his last. He would later become famous for his role in developing the German Bewegungskrieg doctrine and leading the 19th Army Corps during the invasions of Poland and France, and the 2nd Panzer Group during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The tanks would be used extensively in the summer of 1929, as we can see here, crossing a bridge that collapsed. Here we have some more photos from the summer of 1929. These photos were probably taken in the fall of 1929. In the winter of 1929, some tanks received a camouflage pattern and were used in exercises with ski troops. All these photos were taken in the winter of 1929 to 1930. In 1929, the army had also decided what upgrades they wanted, which were headlights, a new Scania Vabis 1554 4-cylinder petrol engine, and either the Skoda 3.7cm D27 or the upgraded Kulsprota M14-29 machine gun. In 1930, 2 of the tanks were upgraded. One of them was number 7. Another was upgraded with a 37mm Skoda infantry gun. Here we see the normal upgraded tank during an exercise in the summer of 1930. All 10 tanks also received a machine gun shield in 1930. Tanks number 2, 3, 4, 5 and 7 were upgraded. The last 3 vehicles were upgraded between 1931 and 1932. The upgraded tanks received the designation Stridsvagn modell 1927-29 Strv M21-29. And the other tanks were redesignated Stridsvagn modell 1927 Strv M21 again. These photos were taken in the summer of 1931. These photos of tank number 4 and 9 were also taken in the summer of 1931. Here we see the last upgraded Strv M21-29 before being completed in 1932. Next to it is the newest Swedish tank, the Landsverk L10, and next to it is the L210 motorcycle and the L185 armored car body and chassis, both of which were sold to Denmark. The Strv M21s and Strv M21-29s were used in winter maneuvers with a camouflage pattern in 1933. Here we see 3 tanks and a Cardan Lloyd Mark V in the winter maneuvers of 1933. Here we see Strv M21 number 10, also in the winter of 1933. These photos and footage of camouflaged tanks were also taken in the mid-1930s, probably in 1933. In the summer exercises of July 1934, 2 M21s should cross a big pontoon bridge, as we see here. In 1935, many of the Strv M21 and Strv M21-29s got some kind of antenna installed in the back, as you can see here from photos and footage taken in 1935. This photo was taken in the mid-1930s. This photo of a tank covered in snow was also taken in the mid-1930s. Here we see three Strv M21-29s, number 4 to the right and number 3 in the middle, and one Cardon Lloyd Mark V and one Cardon Lloyd Mark VI. These images were taken in the mid-1930s. Here we get a closer look at the two rear tanks. In 1936, a few tanks were used in trials driving off-road, but it was clear that the tanks were in need of replacement. Here we see three photos from the summer of 1936. During the second half of the 1930s, the Hungarian LK-2 tanks were seen as obsolete and scrapped by the garrison. Two turrets were later used on an armored train. In 1939, one LK-2 tank was found hidden in a closed shed at the Ørkentar barracks. The tank did not exist in the official records and was deemed obsolete, and was sold for scrap metal. One single Strv M21-29 was used in the summer and winter exercises of 1938, together with the new Strv M31 and Landsverk L120. 1938 would also be the last service year for the Stridsvagn modell 1921 and Stridsvagn modell 1921-29. Here we see an Strv M21-29 next to a Landsverk L60S prototype. These pictures were taken in the second half of the 1930s. When the tanks were phased out in 1938, it was decided to keep 4 tanks, number 2, 3, 5 and 9, and use the rest as target practice. It is believed that Strv M21 number 10 was transferred back to Germany in 1938, probably to the Zeughaus Museum in Berlin, where it was on display together with other German World War I era armored vehicles, like an Erhard EV4 M17 armored car and an A7V replica. It was likely destroyed by Allied bombing raids in 1945 and did not survive the war, if it was ever sent to Germany. In the winter of 1940, a tank was dragged across the ice to the island of Store outside Stavanger. As you can see here, Store was a shooting range where the tanks in the mainland shot at the targets set up on the west coast of the island. The tank on Store sank into the water over time and was completely lost under the water after some time. In the summer of 2003, the remains of the tank were found, and a few weeks later, the remains were rescued, as you can see here. The remains are now in the Arsenal Tank Museum storage. Strv M21-29 number 2 was given to the Södermanlands Regiment in Strängnäs in the late 1930s or in the early 1940s and was used as a monument. In 2001, it was given to the Skaraborgs Regiment P4 in Skövde and was restored in the following years, and is now also a monument at the Skaraborgs Regiment P4 in Skövde. Strv M21-29 number 3 was used as a monument at the Gotlands Regiment in Visby. When the Gotlands Regiment emerged into the Gotlands Brigade in 1993, it was given to the Panzermuseum Münster. The tank received a new camouflage pattern, matching the 1918 LK-2, and has been on display in Münster since 1993. Strv M21-29 number 5 was given back to the Sjötta Lifeguards in Enköping in the late 1930s or in the early 1940s and was used as a monument. It was placed on public display at the Tank Museum Axvall in 1969. It was on display at the Army Museum in Stockholm at some point in the 1970s. It was also present at the Skaraborg Regiment's 350th anniversary in 1981. In 2001, the Axvall Tank Museum began investigating whether it was possible to restore it. In 2011, it moved to the Arsenalen Tank Museum. The restoration work would first begin in 2013, and it took 4.5 years and 5,000 man-hours to restore it. And it was finished in 2018 and is now on public display at the Arsenalen Tank Museum. At some point in 2018, it was painted in a grey color, also used in the early 1920s. Strv M21 number 9 was used as a monument until 1969, when Panzermuseet in Axval was opened, and the tank was placed on public display together with Strv M21-29 number 5. The Axval Tank Museum was closed in 2009, and the collection was moved to the Arsenalen Tank Museum, which opened in 2011, where Strv M21 number 9 still is today. A total of 4 tanks exist: 3 Strv M21-29 and 1 Strv M21.